Welcome to the Mothman in the Bible Belt podcast with your host, Buck Fantastic.
Girl Scout cookies.
Medicine historian Dr. John M. Riddle was a history department chair and alumni distinguished professor at North Carolina State University. He's authored numerous books on plant-based birth control, medicine, and human sexuality, such as Contraception and Abortion from the Ancient World to the Renaissance, Eve's Herbs, A History of Contraception and Abortion in the West, Dioscorides on Pharmacy and Medicine, and Goddesses, Elixirs, and Witches, Plants and Sexuality Throughout Human History. Dr. Riddle is my first guest on the inaugural episode of the Mothman in the Bible Belt podcast. He'll be joining me, your host, Buck Fantastic, to discuss the history of plant-based birth control and abortifacients. Welcome, Dr. Riddle.
Pleasure to be here.
So what got you interested in studying the history of abortion and plant-based birth control?
Well, little background. I was trained in history of early science. I got interested in the history of pharmacy because I had a project on Dioscorides, who was a Greek herbalist and a fantastic mind. One person called him probably the greatest scientist in antiquity. And so I was studying his manuscripts. And, well, here's the way it really happened. After that study of the manuscripts, I was given a component of a course in the medical school at Duke University, just for med students. And I was showing slides of herbal manuscripts, and in the course of which I would describe a plant and what they said it did it, that it worked. So a student, after maybe 5 or 6 plants, said, yes, but does it work? And I said, historians don't deal with that question. And he folded his arms, put his notebook down and slammed it. And then I realized I lost that class. And if I don't deal with that question, it was a legitimate question. So I started researching not just what they said about herbs, but connected them with modern medical knowledge. And one little example is I had a friend who had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. This was in the late 60s, and he was treated at Johns Hopkins. So I checked with him and said, what are they giving you? And he said, 2 experimental drugs, vincristine and vinblastine. And so I looked up those drugs, and I found that those drugs had a natural home. They were herbs or compound derived from them. And then I looked it up in Dioscorides. He did treat cancer. And so the question was, why was an experimental drug at Johns Hopkins being used for cancer treatment when the Greeks already knew about it? Now, it's quite obvious to me that the Greeks didn't know how to get the exact compound amounts, but they could tell whether the herb was reducing a tumor or the cancer, or was doing nothing, or even making it worse. And so I found out that we were then using 9 different drugs for cancer, and 7 of them, the ancients and the medieval people, were using it to treat cancer. And so it went from there. One of the things that every one of the pharmacy texts had usually was something to control birth. They would cause an abortion, or often just simply stated, cause menstruation which has ceased, which could be and was an abortifacient if the person was pregnant and are probably taking it for that purpose. And so I looked at the pharmaceutical literature, and that started in 1942 in an Australian veterinary medicine journal, which they reported sheep grazing on a particular plant in Australia were having ovulation problems. And they discovered that the plants were stimulating the production of estrogen. So I found out in modern pharmacy that plants could stimulate estrogen or block it. Same thing with progesterone or inhibit it. And so those are the two compounds in the birth control pill that we thought we discovered in the 1950s. And so I looked at the text, and yes, doctors did give herbals for avoiding pregnancy and for ending it, usually, just about always, in the early stages of what we say in the first trimester. And that fit exactly with one, medical text, and secondly, anthropologists who were reporting these plants being used in Africa and Asia, especially India, and other indigenous populations, so where they use traditional medicine. So it just came together.
When did women start having abortions?
Well, I'm sure they started having them before we have any writings, because the earliest examples appear in Egyptian papyri and also in Sumerian prescription literature.
I saw that Sumerian. It was in It was in Eve's Herbs, I believe. How far back was that? Because that predates the Egyptian papyrus, medical papyrus, right?
What, the Greek?
No, the Sumerian.
Oh, Sumerians. Well, yes and no. The papyrus we have, like Abus papyrus and so forth, we have known when those papyrus were written on the basis of linguistics, but we also know that they were compilations from earlier ones that have been lost. So it's no way to really say this is when this was discovered. But the things they said, and they would often say, the text would say, for a woman who does not wish to be pregnant, and that sort of thing. So it's pretty clear to me. Now, one more thing. People say early medicine could only be placebo effect. You and I know that pregnancy is not going to be a placebo effect. You can take something if you think you're pregnant and you take it and you're still pregnant and deliver, you know it didn't work. But if you took it in order to cease pregnancy, and it worked. And so it's not a placebo effect there.
From what I gathered, women, in terms of what people have written, they've been terminating their pregnancy for about 6,000 years.
Yes, that's right.
When did women start using contraception?
They used it from the early Egyptians in the cuneiform. Take this if you do not wish to become pregnant.
How did people distinguish between contraception and abortifacients back in the day?
it gets a little slippery in there, as you can imagine. They would say, take this if you do not wish to have a child, or take this if you are pregnant, or take this if you have missed your menstrual cycle. Now, of course, there are other reasons for missing a menstrual cycle, but those are the kind of circumlocutions that are in the text. Now, mind you, the texts are just about always written by men, but how did they learn it? They learn it from folk medicine. Where is the folk medicine residing? In midwives.
Several folks like Cyranus, St. Alberto Magnus, Clement, Tertullian, Constantine opposed abortion, yet wrote about various recipes that induced an abortion. Were they really opposed to abortion, or was it code for something?
Abortion was not countenanced by the church. It wasn't, first of all, birth control didn't have the level of an issue in ancient or medieval cultures that it has in our own.
They said they were opposed to abortion, but yet they're writing about it left and right, about these recipes that women can take.
Well, I raised that question at a meeting and didn't get any satisfactory answers. But now he did it in two different places. In his theological works, Albertus Magnus did not accept abortion. In his works, De Plantis, on plants, he has plants that are contraceptive and early term abortifacients. And I don't think I'll ever get to heaven, but if I do and see Albertus Magnus, I'm going to ask him, how could you do this? And my guess is this, just a guess, because God created these plants and gave them a purpose. Some plants cause women to not have a child or to abort. He was simply writing down what God's will was. Now, he's not advocating doing it, but he's saying these are the characteristics of these plants.
Were women of all faiths terminating their pregnancy and using contraception hundreds of thousands of years ago? Or just particular women of different faiths?
100,000 years ago?
Well, hundreds, well, I should say hundreds of years or thousands of years.
Oh, absolutely. Interesting. In 1276, a man by the name of Peter of Spain,
the Pope,
became Pope. And he had written, which is attributed to his fame, called Treasuries for Poor People. What he was concerned about was that apothecaries, druggists, were getting the market on drugs, which had formerly been grown in gardens and in the woodside, and charging high prices. And so he wanted people to have drugs from plants that were in their gardens and in their woodlands. And strangely enough, that work, the Treasury for the Poor, has more abortifacients and contraceptives than any other single work in medieval medicine. And he was a pope.
Yeah, he wrote people should consume pepper, an abortifacient, in large quantities, rue, an abortifacient, chass plant, a possible male contraceptive, calumet, an abortifacient, and costus, another abortifacient, to reduce consequences of sex and pregnancy. Yeah. So was this Pope was he pro birth control, pro abortion, or?
He's not taking an issue on that. He simply said this is what these plants do. He's not advocating it. And in fact, practically no treatise advocated it.
What were the attitudes on sex and human sexuality thousands of years ago compared to today? Were people more, I guess, loose and more free?
Well, for the most part, yes. I mean, there were constrictions. Uh, it's not that people didn't believe in extramarital sex, but they did protect the family and legitimacy of the family. That's what the law really protected. Uh, Put it in very crude terms, but it's what the law said. It was to protect a man right to have legitimate children and pass on his legacy.
You wrote about a correlation between population decline and birth control. You wrote the Roman Empire during the early Middle Ages, where family sizes were static or shrinking. Is there like die-hard proof that birth control and abortion was in play, or could this have been because of same-sex love to thwart off pregnancies, or what?
Well, the Romans had no laws controlling sexual activity. First of all, they didn't have the police apparatus that could have enforced such laws. Uh, what they were trying to protect was the right of the father to have legitimate children that he wanted. They did have, in the later empire, liability laws for drugs taken, which would include abortifacients that cause the death or severe complications of the woman. But that was a liability.
How greatly was abortion and contraception regulated before modern times throughout history and all over the globe?
For the most part, it wasn't. Simply, it was what women wanted. Now, most societies are pronatal. They want to have children. There's circumstances where they don't want to. And that was, I think, prevalent in all societies globally, as it is now. Interestingly, a fairly new book on uh, abortion in Ireland in the 20th century, because Ireland was one of the most Catholic of the churches, very strict laws about birth control. Irish women were taking many of the same drugs as they were in the Middle Ages. So abortion was going on in Ireland. The women had to learn what it is through the underground and take it. What we call wise women.
What's the difference between regular pennyroyal, the plant, and the essential oils? Based on what I've read, it's like the essential oils are more toxic, right?
Pennyroyal was taken as an early term abortifacient. It was taken as a tea. A little something that's interesting in that connection, especially was prevalent in the 19th century. Any drugstore would have pennyroyal tea, and it cost, most of the boxes cost 4 cents. Sometimes I'd have a few other ingredients. But a woman in Colorado, this is, I can't remember the years, but I think the 1950s, went to read that pennyroyal will cause an abortion, and she didn't want to have a kid. She went to a druggist and said, I want some pennyroyal. He gave her a little flask, which was pennyroyal oil, and it's a concentration. She took it and she died because the oil was concentrated and it was the equivalent of over 7,000 cups of tea. So, I mean, you just can't say, I want this and I'll take it for that. You got to know the amount and how to prepare it.
From your books, I gather that many of these abortifacients were passed down orally because they don't state the amounts about exactly how much abortifacient a woman should take, correct?
That's correct. Now, some texts do, but very few. They'll say things like as an infusion, or as a tea, or the leaves. You got to know your herbs because some drugs from plants can be extracted with latex or water. Some cannot, but those same plants can have the active compounds released through oil. So you've got to know how to do it. If you look in which I did, went to the library and look at small town newspapers in the 19th century, and they were filled with little small inch or half inch ads for women's problems. They had all kind of strange names like the monthlies, Luna pills, for cramps and things of that sort. But women knew what they were buying. And there wouldn't have been, I don't think, a drugstore in the United States that didn't have and sell these prominently. Now, the men wouldn't know what the devil these things were. I went to a drug collector, and he had, this was in California, he had reconstructed a number of 19th century and early 20th century drug shops with the original materials. He was a great collector. And when I went in there, it looked like 15 to 20% were drugs for women. And that's what they were. Now, I suspect the druggist knew what he was selling, vaguely. The men walking in those drugstores wouldn't know. They would just know they were drugs for women. And when certain states started outlawing birth control, several of them tried to list what the plants were. But the problem with that, they would write the law and then they would find out, well, then women were buying another herb that worked just as well. So they couldn't list them all. It's sort of like we've experienced in our culture when the popular culture was discovering hallucinatory and mind-altering drugs, and they kept ahead of the law trying to be made for them, the discovery. One state thought that they could solve the problem. I think it was Arizona, made it a law to sell, to manufacture, sell, or to take, or to possess any drug exclusively for women.
Crazy.
You can imagine the law enforcement problem there.
In Eve's herbs, you state pregnancy was not thought to have occurred until a woman declared it, or her pregnancy was so visibly evident that it could not be denied. What happened to that mindset?
First, the stethoscope. When a doctor could hear a fetal heartbeat, and secondly, the doctors were able to determine a lot more, plus the study of embryology. This began in earnest, I guess, in the 1820s, when the old idea was that A man deposits seed in a woman's womb, and the woman's body takes an indefinite and invariable time whether to accept the seed. When she accepts it, then a fetus is formed. Now that they thought that the fetus went through a development stage until there was a certain point when the fetus was capable of surviving outside the womb, because accidents and so forth cause women to prematurely have a miscarriage or to have the wound open and the fetus could survive. So they knew that a fetus had capability of life prior to birth. So when is that period? The answer that in Aristotle and then later picked up by most of the church fathers, uh, including St. Augustine or of Hippo and St. Thomas Aquinas, was when the fetus was capable of survival. That was known as quickening in the English vocabulary. When does a woman become quickened? In popular culture, that was when she could feel the fetus kick. So that was be late second trimester or third trimester, which is really what Roe versus Wade picks up on that very same thing. Namely, it was the traditional right of women to end a miscarriage, end a pregnancy up until the point of a fetus being viable. That's what Texas is trying to do right now, is move it back to 6 weeks.
What's your thoughts on that? The 6-week abortion ban in Texas at the
Well,
Supreme
that's when
Court?
they claim that a fetal heart can be heard, but they're probably incorrect on medicine there. That's not a fully formed heart at that point. But pregnancy is stages and a smooth stage. And so you can't go from one to the other and say, here's the breaking point. So if you're going to have a breaking point, it's the viability of the fetus.
So how popular was silphium as an abortifacient? Even though it went extinct, it was written about. Yeah, silphium.
Yeah.
It was written about in the Middle Ages and even had a substitute, asafoetidalt. I can't pronounce it. It was used it was as expensive as silver before it went extinct.
Well, now silphium is a species of ferula, and that became extinct. The last use of it was in a Christian bishop who had a letter from his brother in Serenia, which is where silphium grew, saying that his brother had found a stalk of it. Incidentally, it's a pretty, 3 or 4 feet tall, and it became extinct. But there was a related species, several related species, but the most prevalent one there is Asafoetida. And it was a substitute. It wasn't as good as was silphium. Years ago, I got a telephone call from a producer of the BBC and asked me if they wanted to do a program on silphium, and they wanted to send a camera crew to Libya to see if they could find it. Supposedly on the mountainside facing the Mediterranean is where it grew, and see if there were any left. And they asked me would I go along and comment with the program. But right at that time is when Gaddafi problems began. And of course, you don't go in that area of the world right now. I really hated that because I would have loved to have gone there to try to find that plant.
Did they find any?
They didn't go because of the war.
Several plants acted as both contraceptives and abortifacients. How were such plants perceived early on by the ancients having dual properties?
Some examples is, let me give you, one is rue. Rue was a early term contraceptive or abortifacient. It was used in salads. So if a woman did not wish to conceive, she would put rue in the salad that the family ate and the men ate. She was taking it as a medicine. The other people were eating it as a food.
Wow. I thought they were like rolling it up into like grinding it and turning it into a pill or something.
No, just rue leaves.
What was the most popular form of oral contraception before the pill when it came to plant-based medicine?
Aristolochia is late. It's called a birthwort. And it was given two things. It was given to end a late term pregnancy, or if there was difficulty in childbirth, it was given because it helped in childbirth. It was the plant known as Artemisia, coming from the goddess Artemis, who was the twin sister of Apollo by Leto, the mother. When Leto gave birth to Artemis, she came out of the womb, but then her brother was still in the womb and her mother was about to die. And so the goddess helped her mother deliver her twin son, Apollo. So it was the goddess of childbirth. But at the same time, it could be used for an abortifacient. Again, like I say, it depends upon the amount and the time period. That was one of them. Let me think of some more. Oh, Queen Anne's lace. Daucus carota.
That's everywhere.
Huh?
That Queen Anne lace grows everywhere.
I know it. There's a novelist in Texas who's written a book on Queen Anne's lace, and she has a plot that they're using it as a contraceptive and growing it, which is the only novel I've ever seen that has footnotes, and she's very generous to footnoting me. Queen Anne's lace, it acts as an inhibitor for transplants. So if you have a fertilized egg, but it's got to attach to the uterus wall, that's the implantation. It will prevent implantation, or it will dislodge it if only a short interval of time, days, has taken place. So it was really sort of the morning after pill. When I first started this, had a friend in Boone, North Carolina. That's the Appalachians. She was a public health nurse, and in the course of the dinner, she asked me what I was working on. I told her contraceptive and birth control plants. And she said, oh, some of my clients take an herb if they don't want to have children. And I said, do they take it early, pre-coitus, or immediately after coitus? She said, both. And I said, but not late. She said, that's right. I said, well, it's Queen Anne's lace, isn't it? She said, how did you know? And I said, well, you just gave me my first reference since the 17th century. Then I found out other women in the Appalachian regions were taking Queen Anne's lace. This one client, one of them became pregnant because she had to go on a business trip with her husband and didn't take with her her mason jar of Queen Anne's lace. And I don't want to tell you how to make it because I'm afraid people are going to follow the example, but it's pretty safe. And it's non-detectable, by the way, because you don't know whether you had to you had your menstrual period because you took Queen Anne's lace or not. But if you took Queen Anne's lace and you at the right time and you became pregnant, you know it didn't work. But women still swear by it.
What about cotton root bark?
Well, that's cottonwood. That came from the African slaves. Uh, and I had past 19th century, I haven't found any usage of it, but I am fairly confident it'd be in the popular culture somewhere. And of course, it's used that way in Africa.
Some of the abortion recipes you write about were used both orally and vaginally. Was this a slip in the pen, or what was up with that?
That's mainly asafoetida and is used in the Middle Ages. Another one is juniper berries. It was the berries were crushed and inserted in the vagina pre-coitus, or the berries could be crushed, rubbed on the penis, and its action is entirely different. It's a uterine stimulant. When injected in the vagina, as it encounters uterine tissue, it causes uterine tissue to go through spasms, which would prevent implantation. In late 15th, 16th century Germany, certain towns were growing in prosperity and others were not. It didn't take any effort at all for the town fathers to recognize that prosperity were occurring in those towns where the population was growing and not where the population was decreasing. They learned enough to know that the women in the towns where it was decreasing were taking juniper. And so these towns outlawed the growing and possession of juniper. Travelers talked about when they'd go through German towns that the juniper bushes had been clipped and cut back because it was illegal to grow juniper. But of course, it's too common, it's too easy to grow, just like growing a marijuana. Law has not been able to prevent its being grown.
When did surgical abortions become popular?
Well, it probably always was, but it never was popular. It was always considered to be last resort, and there was never a period in which it became popular. It was used more in the 19th century as states started outlawing abortion, and with women not getting the traditional knowledge they had gotten from their mothers, because that was dangerous knowledge. That goes back to witchcraft and is a whole new story.
With so many substances in nature that can terminate a pregnancy, can we as a society technically ban abortion?
You can ban it. You will not ban its use. It will be in the culture and beyond the reach of law, simply because The plants that can cause an abortion are common and they can be ingested. How in the world are you going to distinguish something like, well, rue, pennyroyal, which you can buy pennyroyal tea in the grocery store? You can't, if a woman is taking it as a food, you don't know whether she's taking it as a food or as a drug. There's no way to write that law.
Hundreds of years ago, people looked at plants as medicine. Today, medicinal plants and herbs are looked upon with suspicion and contempt. Yet many plants and herbs like ashwagandha, butterbur, feverfew, passionflower, valerian, and berberine are still popular and in many studies have been found effective at calming people down, getting folks sleep, reducing migraine frequency, and lowering cholesterol. Why do you think people look at plant-based medicine today as quackery?
Well, it's not quackery unless they don't know how to use it or prepare it. If it is professionally used properly, then it's a medicine. If it is used in a fraudulent way or ignorant way, it could be a poison and a person should be liable for it. Just like the Romans protected women from the liability of malfeasance.
You hypothesize in your books that plant-based abortifacients and contraception fell out of popularity after the 15th century because of their association with witchcraft, being a slut, and religious dogma. Can you
Yeah.
elaborate on that?
When you look at the things that witches were accused of being, the so-called 7 things, 5 of the 7 have to do with sexuality. Women were accused of stealing babies, killing babies, not allowing babies to be baptized, and so forth. And we don't have really great records, but we know that approximately, this is by some German studies, 700 and a half thousand, in other words, 750,000 people, women were burned at the stake or killed for being witches. The so-called witch's brew had abortifacients in it. And so, the other thing, the records, such as they are, don't give occupations. First of all, most women didn't have occupations, but where there's an occupation listed, it's witchcraft or hyphen midwives. So, as one midwife said, to know how to cure is to know how to kill. So what they were doing is exterminating as best as they could those women in communities who knew about birth control.
Let's talk about the chase plant. It was used as male contraception back in the day, right?
Yeah, this was Agnes castus, which is known as the chase plant. In fact, the Greek word for chase is the name of that plant. It is a fairly common, low, small tree, and they took the bark. The bark is a spermaticide for men. And in laboratory tests, with mice and also with dogs, the higher you get in the animal kingdom, the better to know how it's going to react on men. It does 2 things. It reduces sperm cell production, and secondly, it reduces libido. So men are not capable of an erection. And it was used, Galen says gladiators had to have, before gladiatorial shows, they were fed this bark, and because they didn't want the gladiators' strength to go into sex, they wanted to go into fighting. In the Middle Ages, it was known as monk's pepper. The bark was ground up, put on food, and so the monks didn't have bad thoughts. It's a male contraceptive.
You write in your books that ancient Egyptian women used crocodile feces and fermented dough as a spermicide of sorts. Do you know if that worked?
No way to tell. There's only one reference to that, but it was one of the earliest of the papyri. And first of all, I went to some microbiologists and I said, how can I learn the chemistry of crocodile feces? And they laughed because, one, these were crocodiles of the third millennium BCE, and the crocodile is extinct. And to learn the biochemistry of the organisms in any alimentary canal is very complex and virtually impossible because of variabilities. Then I discovered that the Egyptian god of abortion was a crocodile. So I didn't know whether I was dealing with religion or whether I was dealing with something chemical. I don't think it was chemical, and I think it was something religious intruding. But incidentally, that's the only place that it occurred.
I want to thank Dr. John M. Riddle for joining me on the inaugural episode of the Mothman in the Bible Belt podcast. I also want to thank Jamie Skeen for creating this killer podcast music. I surely learned a lot today about ancient birth control and abortifacients and all the causal things women stuck in their vaginas to ward off a baby. Hopefully this podcast has educated and informed you on one of the most divisive issues of our time, abortion. And hopefully many of you obsessing over it will find something else to preoccupy your time with, like charades, golfing, knitting, or trying to alleviate poverty and homelessness and bring about world peace. New episodes of the Mothman in the Bible Belt podcast drop every Saturday. Keep a lookout on my webpage, mothmaninthebiblebelt.com, for links to all the cool and new exciting places where you can stream and download my podcast. Thanks for listening.